Hello everyone, welcome back to another deck profile with me, Chocobilly. And this week I am looking at a deck called Warped Sense of Humour. As you can guess from the name, it focuses on the warp mechanic, and outside of like cards that actually use warp, there aren't many cards that, you know, kind of interact with warping outside of, there's the Golbez from Opus 19 and Vayne from Opus 19. And Vayne is a really good card. He's a really fun card as well. But obviously, being able to just, you know, take a warp counter off a card and then drawing cards whenever warps come off as well is really effective. One problem is that, like any good card, he has to stick around to really gain his value, and no good card ever sticks around. But yeah, when I kind of built this deck, I put a lot of cards in here that could easily be taken out. But I put them in just because of the warp mechanic, and I want to test them out, and, you know, some work, some don't, and I'm kind of going to go over that now. So I'll start with the forwards, then I'll move on to the backups, and then the summons and monsters. So first up we have Kryl. So Kryl obviously doesn't interact with warp in the slightest, but she can be utilised in some other ways. So obviously she can cast summons from your opponent's break zone or your own break zone, and while there are only 8 summons in this deck, which obviously isn't too many, she kind of gives a false increase to these summons because you get to recast them ultimately. And also casting things, again, from your opponent's break zone. Now, the one problem with that is the fact that she has to pay the correct elements to cast those, which means that you have to color fix. That's why I'm running Kimari in the deck, because Kimari gains the elements of the characters your opponent controls, which means that ultimately, you will be able to cast a lightning summon if your opponent has something of lightning on the field. And even if they are using cards that generate the CP but don't actually gain the CP color, or the element, sorry. For example, the Wind Moogle that can generate Earth. As long as they're using that false Earth CP to play an Earth forward, or Earth character, then you should still be able to generate that, because ultimately Kimari can generate CP can generate elements of the characters they control, so literally any. It doesn't have to be just the backups as well. But yeah, being able to recast an Asura, or Chocobo, or Mist Dragon from your break zone in the midst of battle is very useful. And just be able to recast them as well. Now obviously they do disappear when they're gone, but I don't have Lulu in the deck, I don't have any means of recurring those summons, so once they're used, they're very much used. So sometimes it can feel bad having to ditch those summons early to play backups, but if you've got something like Kryl in the deck, ultimately you still cast them. Now, she actually shares a similar kind of trait with Beldat. So Beldat, obviously, she makes your opponent mill cards when a warp counter is removed, and when she enters the field, you choose a forward in your opponent's break zone, and you can cast it. Now, the problem here is the fact that you have to pay the correct element. So Kimari, Tyro, Shantoto will again be used. So Beldat and Kryl have similar effects in that regard, and that's actually what made me think about Kryl and put her in this deck, and she's a very useful card. But yeah, Beldat, you still have to pay the correct elements, so why not? Zidane. So again, this is actually kind of it's an unintentional mill deck, because you've got things like Zidane and Beldat, and not Kryl, but still being able to remove things from your opponent's break zone is useful nonetheless. So it means that she can capitalize on so I'll go back to Kryl again, aren't I? It's good to talk about Kryl this entire video. It means that if your opponent does mill, say, 2 summons through Beldat, not ideal because you want forwards, because you want to cast them with Beldat, but it means that you can still then use Kryl to remove said summon and cast it. Anyway, sorry, Zidane. Generic good win card anyway, and using stuff like Asura, Chocobo, Kusith, it means that you can still cast summons, easily get to Zidane's 3 cast limit, and then play them onto the field and mill your opponent a couple of cards. And again, being able to cast your opponent's forwards as well. And that's the funny thing in this deck, is that it is such a, not tribal deck, but so many of the forwards do focus on the warp mechanic and are kind of isolated because of that. It means that you can play some of your opponent's forwards as well, and they'll probably be just as useful. And if your opponent's running, again, a very tribal deck, using stuff like Zidane and Beldat to be able to cast them, and Kryl to be able to cast your opponent's summons, you know, ultimately you can still have a decent pool of forwards and summons to be able to cast. Null, just a really aggressive card that's very useful. Break a forward for, is it forward or character? A character form also, that's very useful. If your opponent's got a Tyro on the field that you don't want them to have, get rid of the Tyro. Just bear in mind, obviously, Kimari might have been utilising that Tyro. Actually, Tyro doesn't gain, does he? Just generates. If Tyro's on the field, he can produce CP, yeah, so never mind. But ultimately, yeah, you can still get rid of Tyro, because it's still a very useful card for your opponent's field. But really, it's the searcher forward here that's super useful. So being able to search yourself a Vayne, a Cloud, a Chaos, Kadaj, whatever, to be able to meet your needs, because this deck is very versatile. What was I looking at? No, sorry. It's a very versatile deck. There's lots of different things in here, but it's also quite sporadic in what it can do. So if you need to break some of your opponent's forwards, you might have to wait a little while just through drawing to actually find those cards. So having a search through Null is very useful. Next up we have Aerith. So again, as I mentioned, having those forwards not really actually get come to hand when you need to be able to play them can be a nightmare. So having Aerith come onto the field through her warp effect and then get you a card back to hand from your break zone is useful. Now, she can actually get a forward from your break zone when she enters the field due to a summon or an ability. So, you know, you could Phoenix, Fenrir her onto the field, but I only have through her own warp effect to be able to play her in this deck. But you could have something like Fenrir in it, for example, so the right elements, and still be able to then retrieve something else from your break zone to your hand. Mist. Again, so if you're not getting the forwards you need to your hand, be able to warp Mist for literally 0, so you can just, nothing else in hand, warp Mist, and have a look at those top cards. And if you don't like them, put them into the break zone. It's not the end of the world. And if you are putting a summon into the break zone, you can still cast it through Cryo. But ultimately, Mist works really, really well with Vayne, because ultimately, Vayne, when he enters the field at the beginning of your main phase 1, during each of your turns, choose one card removed from the game with warp counter on it. You may remove one warp counter from it, and when a warp counter is removed from a player's card, then draw one card. This effect will only trigger once per turn. So Mist, it means that you could warp her for 0, then play Vayne, remove a card, or sorry, remove a counter. You can then trigger it so it goes Vayne, then Mist, Mist resolves, you look at the top card, nope, I don't want to draw that, put it into the break zone, you then draw the following card. So, you know, that works quite nicely. And again, that can happen every single time on your main phase as well. So going to your main phase after your opponent's turn with Mist and Vayne on the field, you can take 2 counters off of Mist, so you can look at the top 2 cards, and then, you know, ultimately get something else through Vayne as well, so if you don't like either of them. And yeah, just hopefully accelerates it a bit more so that you actually get a card you need to your hand to suit the needs of the current field status. Right, Rinoa, probably the worst card in the deck. She's really useful at breaking smaller forwards. But the problem is, smaller forwards these days are either generally monsters, or, yeah, they'll just keep on coming back anyway, but the problem is that your opponent plays lots of big forwards, 5 CPs, 6 CPs, then playing Rinoa and then paying the 6 CP as well. That kind of sucks. Now, obviously, she can warp for only 1, but even then, having her come onto the field, unless you've got something like Asura on the field, or Asura in your hand, sorry, or technically in your break zone if you want to use it through Cryo, playing Rinoa coming onto the field, then paying the 6, then, you know, Asura-ing or something like that is fine, but ultimately, she was in here just because of a warp, and she was a form of removal. But really, I think you could probably put something else into the deck. Actually, maybe Luna Freya, because she's also warp. Takes a bit longer, but still warp nonetheless, and she can also break something as well. Morrow, so his EX Burst is very, very useful. Again, similar to Mist, it helps you kind of look through your deck and actually, you know, choose cards that kind of suit the needs of the moment. But the fact that he only gets that effect through warp as well when he actually enters the field is a problem. However, the haste is a nice blindside to your opponent as well, so you immediately just play him onto the field and then just haste through. Because this deck has such a wide variety of forwards, your opponent can't really predict what's happening, and so haste might not be the first thing on their mind. Right, next up we have Kadaj, and Kadaj can't be mentioned in this deck without Chaos. Chaos is such a good card. To be able to play a 9-cost forward onto the field, and then also search and play a dark forward of 4 or less is really, really powerful. And things like Kadaj and Xenos are pretty good. I mean, Kadaj is ultimately a fantastic card. Remove things from your opponent's break zone, dull a forward, or choose a forward and give it +2 and Brave. It's really powerful. Ultimately, removing the cards is probably the thing that's going to happen, because that synergizes really, really nicely with Bel'Dat as well. You make your opponent mill 2 cards, Kadaj, remove those 2 cards potentially if they're not forwards, which you could otherwise cast through Bel'Dat. You know, or if your opponent's running Lightning, removing those summons from the break zone so Man in Black can't cast them. You know, just getting rid of any Kusith targets. Fantastic card. And just, yeah, really good protection. I don't need to sing this card's praises because everyone knows what it does, and it's a really good card. Kelga. So, yeah, one of the, I guess, the dichotomies of Wind is the fact that it's got decent breaking for bigger characters, but the problem is they tend to cost a lot as well, because ultimately if you weren't paying much to break a large forward, that would be kind of unfair. So most of the summons tend to be around 4 CP to break these cards. But having Kelga just enter the field, pay 1 additional wind, and then break a forward of 4 CP or more, And then also having potentially Haste, First Strike, and Brave is really, really good. You're just having him sat there constantly with First Strike. Now, he is only an 8k, which isn't the biggest these days. But still, if you can kind of combo that with maybe... I don't know, can't think of anything now, but maybe another buffing summon or something like that isn't in this deck ultimately. But, you know, just giving... kind of capitalizing on his First Strike is very, very useful. And just having him sat there, being a good blocker is really good. And being able to just cheat him onto the field, break something, I like it. Vayne. Already gone over this card, but when you consider all the warps in this deck, I think it's well worth having this card, because ultimately you can just keep on drawing cards, keep on playing things onto the field, and obviously this card works excellently with Estinian, because you play Estinian, who has a warp 1, or you warp Estinian, you then play Vayne onto the field, you draw yourself a card, Estinian enters immediately, and he can start swinging 2 turns. 2 turns for 2 attacks, sorry. Which, as I mentioned earlier with Morrow, you know, that haste might blindside your opponent. Chances are they're going to have something to say about it, maybe an Amaterasu or the like, but either way, being able to just Estinian immediately with Vayne is really good. And again, you get a card to hand. If your opponent does maybe cast Amaterasu, Mist Dragon, cancel it. You know, even if you don't have any Mist Dragons in hand, maybe Kral can cast it from your break zone. Maybe you can cast Mist Dragon from your opponent's break zone, you know. Either way, Estinian and Vayne are a match made in heaven. They work so, so well together. But as I mentioned before, Vayne works really well with all of the warps in this deck. Mist is really good because it's a consistent one. You can keep on getting loads in. Making your opponent mill 4 cards in 1 turn with Beldap. So, you know, you warp her, and then you play Vayne, warp 2 cards. Following turn, warp further 2 cards. Comes into the field. I mean, it could be that you've got... Theoretically, you could have 2 Beldap warped, and then play Vayne, remove a counter from 1. Then the following turn, you would remove 3 counters, 2 from each Beldap's warp's own effect, but then you would then use Vayne's effect to remove the final counter off the other Beldap. So you make your opponent mill 6 cards in one go, and then one of them would enter, and ultimately you get to steal one of your opponent's forwards as well, which is quite fun. Next up we have Xenos. So Xenos is nice, but he's also a little restrictive as well, because he has to break a forward of 3 to then gain either haste or make your opponent discard a card, which is a shame. Now, there are lots of forwards that get played of 3, but still, it does mean that sometimes you're not quite in the right position to be able to use him. However, Chaos into Xenos to make your opponent, to break one of your opponent's forward, and then make them discard a card, that's quite the swing in your favour, and he is a big forward, and you can play him from your break zone as well. The one problem here is the fact that this deck doesn't ultimately like your opponent or having break zone hate. So you want Xenos and Kadaj in your break zone when Chaos goes to the break zone, because you can then just pay the Earth and remove Chaos and both your Dark forwards to then break a forward as well. And then finally we have Cloud. So yeah, making it so that you cast lots of things, and then playing Cloud for only 2 CP is the play here. Break lots of forwards, but you know, Asura, Chocobo, Kusith, Mist Dragon, whatever. Kryl ultimately is still casting something. Zidane, that's still casting something. Beldap, that's still casting something. When you're casting things from your opponent's deck, it still counts as cast, but it's nice because it doesn't count from your hand. So long as you've got the CP to pay. And again, this could be something like maybe Zidane enters the field. Well, actually, no, let's say Beldap enters the field. You then cast one of your opponent's forwards. You then maybe, I don't know, use Kryl's effect to then cast Asura to reactivate your backups. You then play Zidane onto the field. That's 3 casts already. You then get a forward from your opponent's deck, or you get a card from your opponent's deck from Zidane. You can then cast Cloud for only 2 CP, and then Zidane can attack. So yeah, this deck really likes having lots of casts, so maybe this could be some sort of variant on that sort of high cast style deck. But yeah, either way, having Cloud just enter the field and potentially break 2 forwards is very useful. And as I mentioned before, being able to break bigger forwards is very, very useful. But also being able to break the small ones, just as useful. Right, next up we have in the backups, we've got Kimari, already gone over this, able to element fix, but through your opponent's elements, which is essential for something like Kryl and Beldap. Riku, so 2 EXs. Having this, just, you know, there's lots of big forwards in this deck, but they tend to have cheap entries, so having an EX that actually can just, you know, stand stuff up is nice. Ultimately, it's just an EX for EX's sake, because it is searchable off of Buddy, and Buddy isn't here to just basically get Kimari, but Buddy into Kimari, if you've already got Kimari in hand, into Riku. At least you've got 2 options for Buddy's search. Chocolate, just to utilise a spare Evray if you ever need to, because Chocolate is really good. Tyro searches your any forward. There are lots of different forwards in this deck, 27 in total, and all of them really, really useful. But if you have Vayne in hand, you get Estinian. If you've got Estinian in hand, you get Vayne. Or if your opponent's got stuff in the break zone you don't like, go get Kadaj, or Chaos to then get Kadaj. There's loads of different good options here to be able to, ultimately just choose something. There's something in this deck that will address the issue. It's just getting that card to hand is ultimately the problem. And then finally Shantoto, because it's Shantoto. Summons Asura. Reactivating all your backups ultimately is the important thing here, but choose a character of 2. There's lots of characters of 2, so, be able to get Zidane, Null, Beldat, Aerith, Mist, Kryl, whatever. Again, there's something in there generally that should be able to meet your needs for the situation you're seeing. Or just be able to reactivate your backups if you really need to, if you're up against ice. Chocobo. Standard Chocobo, because getting stuff back to hand is nice. Plays it down onto the field. Chocobo and back to hand. Plays it down back onto the field. Mill your opponent 3 cards rather than 2. Kusith, standard Kusith, be able to get stuff back to your hand, and similar for Mist Dragon as well. But as I mentioned before, all these cards really, really useful with Kryl, because you get to recast them, and ultimately that's your only means of getting these summons back anyway, so be able to just straight up cast them is nice. Now the one problem with Kryl's effect is the fact that after she enters the field, you then have to pay the additional 1 to choose one summon. For me, the player's break zone and cast it. And that's one of the reasons Evray, I think, makes a lot of sense in this deck, because there's lots of 1 payments. So with Kryl, you have to make that 1 payment and then cast the summon. But it also works very nicely with stuff like Estinian, Kelga, that additional 1 payment, Moro 1, Renoa 1, Mist 0, Aerith 1, Beldat 1. So all these warps, all these effects have just 1 additional payment, and Evray is able to utilize that to the best of its ability. And if you find that you aren't using it for that, chug a latte or Tyro, because why not? And that is the deck, people. Like I said, there is a few cards in here I'd take out. I'd take out Renoa. I'd probably take out Aerith, just because Aerith, I never really actually got to use her effect. It's a really useful effect, but if you don't have another means of playing her onto the field through an ability, then maybe it's not worth it. Kryl is very useful, but only in certain matchups. So Kryl you could probably drop down to a 1-of. Kelga, again, similar, it's certain matchups. Moro, I don't think I'd include either, because whilst the haste is nice and searching through stuff is nice, both Earth and Wind have other means of doing that. You could also use just more water if you really wanted to, because ultimately you are in a sort of rainbow deck with multi-element, so having stuff like Tyro and Kimari down is nice, but, it depends. Maybe you want to run the Opus 19 Riku, which allows you to play anything from 10, just with Riku. Be quite nice, but that becomes a bit more limiting. I'd rather have the EX personally. But, if you've got something like Riku on the field and Kryl, use Kryl's effect, cast a summon, play Riku, reactivate Kryl, use Kryl again, maybe if you're using Riku, you maybe want to add in some more forwards with dull abilities. But let me know what you guys would change about the deck. Let me know how you might change this up. What sort of warp decks have you guys come up with? Because obviously the main focus was utilizing Vayne with Golbez, because, those cards are really very strung together, but I wanted to focus more on actual cards that just warp themselves. So yeah, lots of fun. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, guys. Stay safe, be lucky, and I'll see you in the next video.